Welcome to Game Programming with Unity. This is your host, Nicholas Bernhardt Zeman. What are we going to learn this section? Well, we're going to learn some really cool stuff this section. And the important thing about game development is having interactive user input. And that's what we're going to learn this section. We're going to learn how to take stuff that the user is doing and turn it into stuff happening on the screen. And that's really the prime aspect of interactive development. Whether it's a game or business application or whatever you're doing, you need to have the user giving you some input, right? And usually it's pretty dynamic input, like a joystick, a mouse, an arrow key, a space key. If you're playing a game, you're constantly adding input. The user, the player, is doing stuff all the time. And so when the player does stuff, we want stuff in the game to do stuff, right? We want to have an input system which allows the player to control their characters, to control actions, and navigate around obstacles, especially moving in a 3D world. And that's what we're going to explore a little bit in this section. So first off, I want to kind of give you an idea of how Unity reads inputs in its virtual input manager. And that's what it's called, an input manager. So let's bring up that input manager. I'm going to go to Edit, Project Settings, and let's click on Input here. And we're going to see, I'm going to collapse everything here so we can see what's going on. All right, let's talk a little bit about how the input manager works. Now, an input can be anything that the game reads on a regular basis. In this case, most of the time, it's a keyboard. If you're using a desktop-based system, it could be a combination of keystrokes and mouse movements and mouse buttons, right? Or a joystick axis or a joystick button. You have a console. You have your joysticks. We call them joysticks or controllers, and they have multiple buttons and multiple knobs and things that we can turn back and forth. We also have the option in using mobile devices to use inputs like the accelerometer or the touch configuration. So we have a touch screen. We can configure our inputs to read touches or multi-touches or gestures like pinch and zoom or swipes, things like that. So anything that we can input into a device, we can read inside of Unity. And we usually plug those inputs, the device hardware inputs, which is directly accessible from Unity by your keyboard or your mouse button or whatever. The device itself is accessible by Unity directly with all the classes that are involved. However, we also have what's called a virtual input system. Now, this virtual input system is really nice because it gives us a lot of prefabbed parameters and attributes that we can adjust and tweak, and we can actually have multiple inputs going into that virtual input, which acts kind of like a buffer. So I can have an input set up for multiple devices. So if I want to use a mouse, or if I want to use the keyboard, or if I want to use the accelerometer, all of those things can go into a virtual input, and then those values can be consistent. So that's what we're looking at here is the virtual input machine. And let's just open up a couple. Generally speaking, we have, let's just open up one here to make it a little less confusing. All right, so let's look at the parameters here. All right, so we have the name, right, and we're going to call out our input by name. So if I say get input in code, and we're going to learn how to script that later on in this section and in the lab, then it's going to say, okay, get input, what input? And we're going to call it horizontal because it has a string that names it. And we can just change the descriptive names if we want. Now, we have a negative button and a positive button. Not all types of inputs have negative and positive values. And that's a good time to kind of look down here and see what type, right, what type of input is this. Now, the thing about a key or mouse button is it's a down and an up, right? So if I click on down, the mouse button there's a state. It can be on or off. And that's an important distinction to make. Now, if I say that it's a mouse movement, right now it's literally like an axis. So, a key or mouse button has a positive and negative, right? So let's just say we're using the arrow keys. So I have a key or mouse button. I can type in my left arrow key or right arrow key down. And you're going to hear it make a noise so it doesn't know what I'm trying to do here. But the left and right arrow key, those can be mapped to a right and left axis, right? So I can tell, is this button down? So there's a positive value, which is the right key, and a negative value. So this is an axis, but it's not a movement of the mouse. It's an axis that's based on a positive and a negative keystroke value. right? And here we have left and right. And if you do a lot of gameplay on a regular PC, there's A, which is left, and D, which is right. Right? Now the gravity here. Now the gravity is, and I'm gonna hover over this a little bit so we can get Unity to pop up its natural explanation of what gravity does or is. Gravity is the amount of increase in the value. So gravity is actually, it's the amount of decrease in the value. Some of these things, they're supposed to pop up with a little bit of dialogue here, but it's not, some reason my mouse over is not working in the inputs, which is ironic. All right, the gravity is how fast it returns to 0. So if we have a left and right value, and we're going left and right, it will return to 0 when you let go of it, and that value is the speed at which it does that. This dead value here, this is actually the analog dead value, so it's a very small range at which it's still 0, and the smaller number you make, the smaller range it is. The bigger number you make, the further you have to move an analog stick to get it to register as a positive or negative value. Now, when we talk about positive and negative values for an axis, you can see here I'm using this as an axis. Then what it does is it will go to a value of 1 or negative 1. So you have a normalize, which means 0 to 1 value. You have a normalize from negative to positive. So an x-axis can be 1 is the highest value you can go, and negative 1 is the lowest value you can go, which would mean in the negative x, which in this case usually means left. All right, so the sensitivity, that's just how sensitive it is to your movement, and that matters a lot in the analog. So how fast does it go from 0 to 1? Well, if the sensitivity is high, it reaches 1 very quickly when you have the positive button on, and negative 1 very quickly with the negative button on. If you change this value of sensitivity to 0.01, it will move towards a value of 1 very slowly. All right, and this snap, this just says, does it snap to basic values as you're moving them. You can invert your axis so that the negative and positive are reversed. And here's our type here. Key or mouse button. Like I said, this is, if we're describing the key button, I have to have a positive button, which is up here, and a negative button. And it allows you to have 2 different buttons mapped to this virtual input. All right, now, if I change this to mouse movement. Okay, mouse movement. The mouse movement will be moving right or left based on the mouse axis, not on a button. So that's why we have a different distinction, right? So if I say mouse movement and then I say y-axis, this means the y movement of the mouse will translate into the y-axis value of our input. Now we can look, and these are all pre-made ones. They're set up for us. I like to use the horizontal and vertical often. Now if you notice here, we have this fire one. Okay, so fire one is it's a button, right? So we have a key or mouse button. They're going to give you an axis, but we're not worried about an axis because we just want an up or down state, right? We want a positive or negative state. So we say that the positive button is a left control. So if I click on the control on the left side of the keyboard, it will register as a positive value. So for fire 1, right? And if I click on mouse 0, which happens to be the left mouse button, and I click that, that button will register as being on or a state of true, right? So this fire 1 and some of these jumps and things like that, or submit, here's one called jump, they're very similar in the sense that it's a button, right? It is an on or off state. Sometimes we can use those buttons as an axis if we have a positive and negative one, but if we don't have a negative version, it's because we don't need one, because it's just a button, and it only reads a state of on or off for that button. And the button actually has 3 states: off, down, which is where it's being held, or up. And there's some differences when we look at the code in on button down, on button up, and actually that's it. On button down, and on button up. There are 3 different states that button can be in, and we need to know how those work in order to set up custom controls for our inputs. All right, so just to recap here, we're looking at an input manager, right? The input manager has all these inputs already set up for us. And it's kind of nice that we have a lot of stuff that's automatically set up. Here's the scroll wheel. So we see mouse movement, but here under axis, we have this third axis, which is joysticks and scroll wheel. So we can use that scroll action from any mouse button, or from the middle mouse button, from any mouse that's hooked up to the Unity development engine. So right now, we've looked at all the ones that Unity sets up for us, and sometimes it has ones that are repetitive, like Fire 1, 2, and 3. And that's so you can map different buttons from different joysticks to it. So we have these joystick buttons. And those joystick buttons have specific hardware values attached to them based on what kind of joystick you're using. Okay, now what I also want to show you is how that we can create our own input. So I'm just going to click on size 19, boom, and it's going to duplicate the name, it's always confusing here, of the input that was last in the list. And then we can just call this custom input, and now we can do anything we want to this. We can say I'm going to mouse movement, I'm going to make it on the y-axis, and we'll get rid of our positive and negative buttons. Our gravity is 1, and our sensitivity is 0.5. So I can change any of the parameters on this custom input I want, and then we can seek for it later on in code. Alright, so that's just a kind of a basic overview of the input manager, how it works, where the pieces are, how to create your own, and what all of these different values in here mean.